Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this third session of the Civic Forum. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rory Truex. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics and the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Professor Mark Beissinger, to the stage here today. Mark is the Henry W. Putnam Professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton. His primary areas of research are social movements, revolutions, nationalism, and state building, with particular reference to the former Soviet Union and its successor states. I should say Mark is in his 24th day of retirement. So this is his retirement summer, and he is joining us on a webinar. So thank you to Mark for giving us your time.
So thanks, Rory. Pleasure to be here. So I gather I'm supposed to give some framing remarks at first. I'm going to focus on the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, Trump's impact on it in particular. As you all know, with the election of Donald Trump to a second term, the U.S. has slipped into some form of soft dictatorship, electoral autocracy, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, that's been affecting us in enormous ways, but it's also producing tectonic change around the world. So since the 2022 invasion by Russia, February 2022, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the United States has stood together with NATO countries in opposing that invasion. I'm not going to recap the whole course of the war, but I just want to give a summary of where that war stands at this point in time and why it stands the way it does. So the Ukrainians were always at a huge disadvantage. On the eve of the war, Russia's economy was 9 times larger and its population 3 times larger than Ukraine's. Russia had almost 3 times as many tanks, howitzers, multiple rocket launchers as Ukraine. Of course, one of the big equalizers has been foreign aid. Since the 2022 invasion, the United States has sent $128 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, mostly weapons. But the U.S. has also not been an entirely reliable partner. The Biden administration prevaricated about sending advanced weaponry, and politicization by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives led to significant shortfalls of artillery shells and at the Ukrainian front lines. So in some ways, the Ukrainians have had to fight this war with one hand tied behind their back. But there have been other things that have been equalizers for them. The other two things are the changing nature of warfare and the differences in morale between the Russian and Ukrainian fighters. So this war has been fought in a dramatically different way than earlier wars. Drones have been playing a major role in this war. 3/4 of recently killed Russian soldiers were killed by drones, for instance. The Ukrainians have built up a major drone industry, domestic drone industry, which has allowed them to overcome some of the other disadvantages they have on the battlefield. Also, the Russian military has been hampered by incompetence, by low morale, by corruption. Russia's main battlefield tactic has been to send wave after wave of recruits into battle, hoping to exhaust the Ukrainians. Most of the recruits were attracted to serve by huge financial bonuses, sometimes several times their salaries, for signing up as, or sometimes as an alternative to serving a prison term. 1 in 5 mobilized Russian soldiers who have died in the war have been killed less than 2 months after enlisting, which speaks to the ways in which the military is using them largely as cannon fodder. So as a result, Ukraine has not really lost the war on the battlefield in a big way because of these equalizers. Russia has not been able to seize full control over the Donbas provinces or over Zaporizhia, or to retake the territory in Kherson region that Ukraine had seized back earlier during its counteroffensive. At best, it's been very slowly eating away at Ukrainian-controlled territory in the Donbas. The pace of that has picked up somewhat in recent months, but still, at the rate that the Russian army is moving, estimates are that it would take Moscow several years to occupy the territory that it formally claims to control, formally annexed in 2022. So the war has also obviously come at a very awful cost, with about 430,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded, and over 1 million Russian soldiers. So Trump has broken with longstanding American policy toward the war. He already had, of course, an ignominious history with Russia and Ukraine during his first term. Russia interfered on his behalf in the 2016 election. The many direct contacts between the 2016 Trump campaign and Russian officials raised serious concerns in Congress and the intelligence community, prompting major investigations and even prompting some prison terms. He also has a troubled history with Zelenskyy, whom he unsuccessfully tried to bully into fabricating corruption charges against Biden's son in order to sway the 2020 election. That led to Trump's first impeachment in Congress. And this pattern has continued into the second Trump presidency. During the 2024 election campaign, Trump boasted it would take him 24 hours to end the war because of his longstanding friendship with Putin. Putin represents the kind of muscle man that Trump aspires to be. They have very similar visions of a world divided into spheres of influence, shorn of constraints by international law, and dominated by a handful of dictators. So Trump also sees enormous business opportunities in Russia. In fact, Putin and Lavrov have been dangling the possibility of building a Trump Tower in Moscow, a longtime Trump aspiration, knowing that Trump cannot help himself when faced with the possibility of a self-serving deal. So his way of dealing with the world is not really that different from his way of operating within American politics. Now, at the same time, Trump has treated Zelenskyy with arrogance, with disdain. I'm sure you all recall the extraordinary meeting with Zelenskyy in the White House in February. Trump and Vance shouted at Zelenskyy. They accused him of failing to thank the U.S. For its aid. They told him that he was holding no cards and was in no position to make any demands in peace negotiations. They interrupted him at one point in time and told him, quote, "You've talked enough, you won't win." And they warned him that he was gambling with World War III. Then they sent him packing with his tail between his legs. So the White House subsequently aligned with Russia at the United Nations in voting against a resolution condemning Russia's invasion. And it ordered all military aid to Ukraine and intelligence sharing cut off. Trump later restored military aid 2 weeks later, after Zelenskyy agreed to accept a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, something that Putin has never accepted. Once again, last month, Trump mysteriously paused deliveries of military aid to Ukraine, including Patriot missiles needed to defend against Russian missile attacks. All this was, of course, to Russia's open delight, and they write about this, quite openly in the Russian press. A short, vague 11-page agreement was signed at the end of April, and in that agreement, Ukraine's sovereignty over its natural resources was recognized, and a United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund was created that will fully reinvest profits from Ukraine's natural resources into the Ukrainian economy for 10 years, exempting American companies who participate from taxes or duties. So significantly, though, the agreement does not commit the U.S. to Ukraine's future security, which contradicts longstanding American policy. In fact, the United States under Trump has essentially withdrawn from any commitment to Ukraine's future. So in this respect, Russia may not have, decisively won the war on the battlefield, but it has been winning the peace. For instance, Trump has broken with a decade of U.S. policy and with international law by announcing that he is ready to recognize Russian ownership over Crimea as part of any peace deal. He has excelled in extracting concessions from our own ally, Ukraine, but he has asked very little of Russia. And what he has asked has been rejected by Putin, who has not made a single compromise at this point. Not only has Putin repeatedly said that any ceasefire would have to follow Ukrainian concessions, but he continues to insist that any peace must, in his words, quote, eliminate the root causes of this crisis, which essentially means that Ukraine needs to concede defeat. He wants a neutered and neutralized Ukraine, completely demilitarized, and its army drastically reduced in size, with an end to all Western weapons supplies and a, quote, ironclad guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. He wants official Ukrainian recognition that the territories that Putin seized, including Crimea, belong to Russia, in all about a fifth of Ukraine's pre-war territory. He wants the Ukrainians to withdraw from the territories claimed by Moscow, but are currently under Ukrainian control. That would be a humanitarian catastrophe because there are large Ukrainian populations that currently live in those territories. Given that Russia currently has the upper hand in the war, Putin has very few incentives to negotiate. He's content to let things play out on the battlefield. Trump reportedly has grown frustrated with Putin's intransigence. In the past, he threatened to impose, quote unquote, bone-breaking sanctions on Russia if Russia didn't make concessions. But he's held Republicans in Congress back from considering any new sanctions on Russia. Of course, we already have a pretty draconian set of draconian sanctions on Russia that Russia has found ways around. Trump said that in June, Russia has 50 days to accept a ceasefire, but from what we know, Putin is not taking him very seriously. In the meantime, the Russian economy is not doing very well. So the banking system appears to be on the verge of collapse. Low energy prices are depleting Russia's reserve funds, and excessive military spending has fostered a very high rate of inflation. So far, Russia has escaped any major impact of the war on the economic well-being of its citizens. But Russian economists are now predicting a recession. And were that to happen, it could have a significant impact on Putin's willingness to negotiate. So in response to this economic situation, Putin has already said that he wants to reduce Russian military spending in a year or two. And that gives some insight into how he sees the war unfolding. That is, in a year or two, he will be able, or he hopes to be able, to reduce spending because he hopes to have negotiated a positive peace. Why don't I stop there? We can open things up to discussion.
Thank you so much, Mark. So there's so much here to discuss. So I wanted to break up our Q&A into a few different parts. The first is just thinking a little bit more about domestic politics in Russia. You talked a little bit about sort of the eroding economic situation. Interest rates are north of 20%. Inflation is north of 10%. But at the same time, and casualties are over 1 million at this point. But at the same time, we see public opinion data suggests that Putin enjoys relatively high approval ratings. We should always be skeptical of public opinion data coming out of an authoritarian country. But I think there was this initial narrative that the war was bungled so badly in the opening months that it could have domestic political blowback and generate instability for Putin himself. And that hasn't really borne out. So can you tell us a little bit about where political opposition in Russia is right now, and what is the level of support and opposition for the war?
Well, first of all, Russia was a pretty repressive place before the war. It's become a much more repressive place as a result of the war. And political opposition, any kind of political opposition, is very, very difficult to express. In fact, a new law was just passed by the Russian Duma that is going to criminalize even looking at any kind of oppositional material on the internet. So it's become extremely repressive and extremely difficult to operate in terms of opposition. People are sent to prison for expressing any kind of opposition to the war. So we really don't know what people are thinking. We know what they're doing. They are expressing their support for the war in general, most people. But we really don't know what the thoughts of people are. Now, economically, I should say, Russia, as I mentioned in my comments, it hasn't suffered enormous economic consequences. At least the population hasn't suffered enormous economic consequences as a result of the war. Inflation has gone up, but and some things have disappeared from the stores. But Russia has very skillfully managed this situation, largely by integrating itself into informal economies and illegal economies. So, for instance, it's exporting large amounts of oil, about the same amount of oil that it used to export, through its shadow fleet. It has a shadow fleet of tankers that it uses to get those out. And India, China have picked up the slack in the oil market. So as a result of that, Russia has had a lot of money still flowing into it, even though very serious sanctions were imposed on Russia after the full-scale invasion in 2022. Sanctions on its financial system, in particular, were significant. So it's managed it in a way, but that could change. And people could feel the pinch a little bit more, and we don't really know how that will reflect itself in public opinion. But the public opinion doesn't have a chance to reflect itself into politics in a big way right now.
We have a wonderful student that we share, Jacob Tucker, who's doing a dissertation on who he's defending in, I think, about a month, if I'm remembering correctly, about propaganda narratives in Russia. And one of his arguments is that the government has just been very effective in creating a very strong narrative about what this war is really about. It's about a war against Western intrusion on Russian sovereignty. Zelenskyy is painted as dictatorial in his own way and corrupt. And the Russian government is sort of noble in its defense of its territory and of Russian people outside of its borders. And so this is a very powerful nationalist frame. And I'm wondering, what does it take to puncture a frame like that? You mentioned that it's now become criminalized to even look at oppositional media. Jacob, in his dissertation, talks about how some people would turn to Ukrainian media to get a better sense of casualties because the Russian state media would underreport casualties. And so there is this, when an authoritarian regime gets too far from ground truth, it can risk kind of delegitimizing its own media apparatus. And so what would it take for this narrative about the war to shift? Would it be catastrophic military failure? Would it be a depression? Like, is there, how it's striking to me how strong the support is and how effective the propaganda machine is.
Yeah, and it's fairly stable, as Jacob finds out in his research, that it hasn't changed that much over the course of the war, and which makes you think that, well, propaganda serves a number of purposes. Yes, it's there to convince, but it also provides a narrative that people can use as in terms of their discourse, and we really don't know what people are thinking. And many people, of course, are not thinking that much about the war if they can avoid it. But some people are thinking about the war, but they have a narrative also that people and those who are not thinking about the war, they have a narrative that they can rely upon, in their discourse. And they also know what the consequences of speaking out are. So what would it take in order to shift things? Most likely it would take catastrophic defeat, which is not a likely thing that's going to happen right now. Russia has the upper hand in the war, very slowly kind of winning territory. But would an economic depression or a recession have an effect on narratives about the war? Probably not. I mean, I think that it also, one thing that could affect it would be Putin's health as well. So when a political opportunity emerges, in particular when a leader is changed, that tends to create dissension within the elite. And people, vying for power often will create alternative narratives, or it will become much more available to talk about alternative narratives, criticizing the previous leader. So Putin, as long as Putin is healthy, as long as he's, exercising power, I don't really see much of a chance of things shifting.
And this is a nice segue in that I wanted to talk a little bit about Putin himself. He's been in power in one way or another for 25 years. He's, I believe, 72 years old at this point. And he reminds me a little bit of Xi Jinping, which is the leader of the country I study, and that these sort of people operating within a one-party system, or kind of in Russia, an electoral authoritarian system, but who nevertheless have kind of strong personalist elements to it, right? The system is very much wrapped around the leader. And these systems take on the life of the leader, the character of the leader. And so in terms of Putin and his legacy, is this, we talk about this with Xi Jinping in Taiwan, is taking Taiwan and is territorial unification for China a core to Xi Jinping's legacy, and that would lead him to do it even if it might be irrational. Can you tell us a little bit about how this war fits into Putin's broader political trajectory and his legacy as he gets towards the end of his time in power?
Yeah. I think people originally imagined Putin as a kind of tin pot dictator. So a dictator basically interested in personal enrichment. And that was not actually what was happening, particularly from, around 2012 onward. He is interested in enriching himself, but he also seems to be drawn to a sense of the grandeur of Russia as a great power, and his role in reestablishing Russia as a great global power. And he sees his legacy, he would like to have seen his legacy as that. The war itself was meant as a way of establishing that legacy. He wants to be known as Vladimir the Great, and similar to Catherine the Great. And in his narratives about why the war began, it's about the fact that these were territories that were owned by the Russian Empire. In fact, he rejects the Soviet legacy. It has very little to do with the Soviet legacy. The Soviet legacy is viewed as negative because the Soviet legacy reaffirmed Ukrainians as a separate nation and, or at least nationality, a separate identity. He's rejected that. And what he seeks is essentially resuscitating Russia's power, especially in Eastern Europe. And it goes beyond Ukraine. He has no opportunity really to do that. The war was a disaster. It was a failed attempt to do that. And he's trying to pull the kind of a rabbit out of the hat of failure, right, at this point in time. That is, they claimed, these territories, these provinces. They formally annexed those provinces. They don't control them at this point in time. But I do think he'll continue to try to wage this war until he extracts that concession from Ukraine, so that he can walk away and say that his legacy was to expand the Russian Empire.
I want to turn also briefly to Ukraine and Ukrainian politics and Zelenskyy as a political figure. I think he became something of a folk hero in the West, certainly on that initial outbreak of the special military operation, with those images of him standing there with all the other people in his cabinet. I think he inspired a lot of admiration during that moment. So I just wonder, tell me a little bit about sort of his political trajectory. There is a narrative in Russia and also in parts of the U.S. political discourse that there's a darker side to him. There's accusations that he's corrupt or dictatorial. He's suspended elections. There's martial law. So can you provide us a little bit of sort of ground truth as to Zelensky's political style and his trajectory in the last few years?
Yeah, Ukraine's been at war, and so that changes the whole nature of politics and make it made elections impossible to carry out in the middle of a war, especially when part of your territory was controlled by an invader. There was no way that free and fair elections could have been held in Ukraine over this period of time. At the same time, Zelensky's been in power for quite a while. And so recently, there were a number of things that he did at the beginning which really accelerated reform and moved things forward in a positive way. But I think now, as the war goes on, there are people around him that he's trying to protect. Recently, a new law was passed that subjected some of the key anti-corruption agencies to the power of the prosecutor, the attorney general in Ukraine, which would allow the attorney general to move cases away from the corruption agencies and even close cases that were there. Now, again, this power hasn't been used, but it could be used. And so there are accusations that he's trying to protect people around him. I don't know of any credible evidence that he himself is personally corrupt, but there has been corruption. And, of course, you can compare that to corruption in Russia, which is probably about 100 times greater than it is in Ukraine. Ukraine has been making a serious effort to try to tackle corruption. And the reason why there is such an outcry to this new law is precisely because of that. So there have been demonstrations in Ukraine against this effort to cut back on the anti-corruption agencies. Just because Ukraine is trying to overcome this doesn't mean that corruption just disappears. And of course, there's been corruption in some of the aid that has been sent to Ukraine. Of course, there's corruption in the American military. Corruption is a very difficult thing to root out. However, the difference in Ukraine is that there is an attempt to bring it to light and to deal with it. That would be my take on what's going on. I don't want to say that everything is great in Ukraine and there's no corruption. Of course there's corruption, just like we have corruption here. But in Russia, there is no process of trying to control that. And it is a country, again, at war. And that does change the nature of things.
Thank you for that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the U.S. in the conflict. And there's arguments, different types of arguments being made. As a China scholar, I see a lot of the arguments that tie the Russia conflict to China. And one of the arguments is that China is the bigger threat, and therefore we need to draw down our military aid to Ukraine in order to prepare for potential war with China, likely over Taiwan, which to me has always seemed a bit strange because we are taking resources away from an active war and moving them towards a hypothetical war, potentially making a security spiral more likely and actually begetting war with China, in my opinion. But that's what we would call like the prioritizer argument. That's like an Elbridge Colby is a prominent thinker who's in the Trump administration now. The other argument is the kind of America First argument, which is why are we spending money on these types of conflicts at all? Why are we giving money to the Ukrainians when we should be investing it at home? So can you weigh in on this a little bit? And if you would, just sort of tell us the stakes of this war. So this is often viewed as a war about rules. And are we going to be a rules-based international order, or is it going to be a might equals right type of international order? So could you tell us a little bit about the stakes?
Yeah, well, that is one of the issues that's there, one of the things that is at stake. Of course, that's also at stake with the Trump administration more generally. Will we be a rules-based, society will we act internationally in a rules-based way? That's part of the affinity between Putin and Trump. But that's not the only thing that's at stake. So, Ukraine is on the boundary of Eastern Europe. It is a key society. If you go back to Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his writings, he believed that Ukraine was kind of the central fulcrum around which the political order of Europe lay, because if a Ukraine under control of Russia transforms the nature of geopolitics in the region. It's not just Ukraine that's threatened by a resurgent Russia, a Russia more willing to use its military might against its neighbors. It's the Baltic states and Estonia who are really, really scared about what's going on right now. It's also Poland, which is also concerned. So, you start eating away and you see the beginnings of a divided Europe again. I should say there are others in East Europe who are also concerned, the Romanians, for instance, the Czechs, and so on. So it is about Eastern Europe more generally, and where the whole post-Cold War settlement lies. That is, the Soviet Union gave up control over Eastern Europe, and now Putin wants to revise that. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and of course, I wrote a book about that, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia recognized the division was transcended. It even recognized that its own republics would be independent states, sovereign states. And it was only later, several years later, that Yeltsin, and it began under Yeltsin, that Yeltsin began to try to assert control, informal control at first, over the former parts of the Soviet Empire. And so it didn't happen right away. And we think about this as sort of, Russia's natural possessions. The people who live in these territories look at it a little bit differently. And they have not eternally been under Russia's control. And so that is critically at stake here. So how does that fit with China in the bigger picture?
You don't need to go there. Yeah. But I think, but I appreciated just your positioning. There are wars that are, I think, sometimes their importance to American national security or the world order can sometimes be inflated. And then there are wars that I think are truly core to American national security and values, and those of our allies and partners in the democratic world. And so I appreciated your ability to put it in context. I wanted to add one last
thing. Europe is very concerned about it. Europe is very concerned about it, and because they see sort of the whole European Union project being threatened to some extent.
Here's a question I wanted to bring in. This is a question from Brooke, really about Europe and how has Europe reacted, and have they done enough, or is there more they can do to support Ukraine? Perhaps one of the consequences of the conflict has been to galvanize Europe and to kind of shift the narrative in Europe about taking more responsibility for defense. So how have you seen the European reaction so far?
Europe has been a bigger donor to Ukraine than has the United States overall. The nature of its aid has been different than American aid. So the United States has given predominantly weapons. Europe has given predominantly financial support. And could Europe do more? Absolutely. And Europe is only beginning to ramp up its defense capabilities in a bigger way. And that's due in large part to Trump. So we should recognize that. It's due in part to Russia as well. But, do we want to give them credit in essence? I'm not sure. Certainly not Russia. Um, but yeah, Europe can do more in terms of the defense. Uh, but it also is the case that with American withdrawal, um, and prevarication has also been a big problem for Ukraine. Um, it's shifted at times the situation on the battlefield. So shortages of ammunition, shortages of shells induced by the fact that the United States prevaricated in terms of allocation of materials. This was even before Trump. That has had a big effect on the battlefield. And so, we have to understand the United States has not been the most reliable partner. If Europe can come in and actually become a more stable, real center of defense for the continent, for itself, that would be a positive thing.
How will this end, right? I mean, the way you've described it, the terms that Putin is willing to accept are fundamentally not not amenable to the Ukrainian people. They would set a precedent that I think Europe and the United States could not abide by. Putin's war effort is flailing, but is going along strong enough that he can keep it going. And so, how does this play out? I think there's this effort at peace talks. I think that seems to be both Putin and Zelenskyy trying to stay in Trump's good graces because he's the kind of pivotal player, but it doesn't seem like these talks really amount to much. And so how does this play out? Is the conflict going to last another year, 2, 3, 4? I mean, it doesn't seem that we don't seem to be anywhere closer to an end from what you were saying today.
Yeah, let me deal with that question maybe first. We don't. And it could drag on for a while, but I think, as I mentioned, I think Putin doesn't want it to drag on, and I think he's committed to trying to seize those territories that he now claims and then negotiate a peace. How long that would take, I don't know. But uh, you know, could Russia sustain war over that extended period of time? I mean, economically, it's going to have a huge cost on Russia. So uh, I think my sense of the likely scenario is that we probably have war for another year or two, and then Putin will likely agree to negotiations. And where those negotiations go and how they fall out, we don't know. Obviously, right now, Putin is asking for the maximum. He would be a fool not to ask for absolutely everything he wants. Um, and most negotiations start off that way. But how it will play itself out, at the negotiation table, and what the role of the United States will be is unclear, because the United States could be a decisive factor, especially Trump, a decisive factor in deciding the parameters of the peace. I don't think Putin's going to give up without taking those territories that he has declared to be part of Russia.
Mark, I wanted to shift directions. We have just a few minutes left. Mark is one of the leading scholars on social movements and for many years taught a course at Princeton on social movements. We asked this question of Kianga Yamada-Taylor last week. We asked just her assessment of the pro-democracy movement in the United States. I know you are a participant in that movement, as you said prior to this session today. So could you tell us a little bit about your assessment of the movement at the moment, and are you optimistic, or what advice would you give? How does the movement need to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, the movement is very fragmented. The movement of opposition to Trump is very fragmented, and dispersed. And that's pretty typical these days of internet-based mobilizations. They are pretty highly dispersed. They lack often clear leadership. But it's also the fact that we're only, what, 5 months into a Trump administration at this point in time. And some of the protests that have been organized have been pretty substantial. It's not, though, the moment right now. So any movement, it's not just what a movement does, it's how it reacts with the political system and the openings and vulnerabilities in the political system. And Trump right now is not particularly vulnerable. He will be more vulnerable at election time, and that also will be a critical moment of where the United States evolves. Are we going to restore democratic norms and procedures, or are we going to continue along the path of sort of an electoral autocracy? And I'm pretty confident that Trump will do his best to push us along the latter path. But what will happen at that moment will require, most likely, a great deal of citizen activism. And it requires to be focused on targets, specific targets, not dispersed geographically across the United States, having protests in every little locality and city. I mean, it's nice for kind of building solidarity. It makes us feel like we know other people, we see that there are other people who believe like us. But in the end, it's going to come down to focusing people in space on a particular place. As I said, the time is not ripe for that at this moment, but it will at some point in time become ripe.
Sort of what you're suggesting is that all of the little protests we're seeing. I was at a protest the other day in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, which is the most, it's a bubble, if there ever was a bubble. And it's a bunch of people, well-intentioned, having signs, getting honked at by cars driving by. All of those little micro mobilizations to me seem like precursors to something like building community, building a pattern of behavior, showing solidarity. But
showing the world there's opposition to Trump.
And a little, I wouldn't call them acts of bravery, because I don't think there's any consequences for doing that right now. But what you're suggesting is there is this sort of focal moment when something significant happens. And we think about South Korea this fall, for example. The declaration of martial law met with people in the streets immediately, and then South Korea basically backslid and then went back, reversed course within hours, right? Because of mass protest. And so what does it look like when there is a real effort to overturn an electoral result, to send different slates of electors? What if that whole playbook comes out again? All of these little actions, those are sort of the precursors to that. So I do think that's how I'm viewing it, and I appreciate your comments.
I think that's true. I do think that there are things along the way which are also significant. So there is an attempt, for instance, to manipulate the electoral system in a big way, and in specific localities. And in doing that, those localities, the activism within those localities is quite critical for trying to contain that. In places like Wisconsin, in Texas, in places where the electoral system is, there's an attempt to tilt it in unfair ways. So it's not like nothing happens up until that focal moment, but that focal moment will require bravery. Because it will be a confrontation. This is not going away. This is not going to go away on its own.
Well, we will leave it there. I told you to give me some optimism at the end. That was more a little stoicism, I think, as a good emotion, but it was good. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you again to Mark Beissinger for joining us and sharing us all of your insights on Russia and social movements. We really do appreciate it.